The woman's name was Emma, a smart, no-nonsense type in her early 40s. After years of climbing the corporate ladder, she decided to take a break from the chaos of city life and found herself moving into a quiet, picture-perfect house in the suburbs. It was the kind of place where the grass was always green, neighbors waved as they watered their lawns, and the local grocery store gave you a free cookie just for walking in. Emma had rented the place online, charmed by the photos of the pristine white picket fence, cozy front porch, and peaceful surroundings. The perfect spot for some relaxation, she thought. But as soon as she moved in, she noticed something odd. Every day, she'd wake up to find things in the house slightly out of place. Her favorite coffee mug would mysteriously appear on the other side of the kitchen. A window she'd left closed would be wide open. Little things that were easy to chalk up to forgetfulness. At least, at first. It wasn't long before the neighbors started dropping hints. Mrs. Henderson from next door whispered conspiratorially one morning as Emma watered her plants.
You know, there are stories about your house. Rumor has it, the original owner disappeared years ago. People say the house is haunted.
Haunted? Please. I don't believe in ghosts. Still, as the days went on, she couldn't deny that something strange was going on. Her mail would be mysteriously sorted, her shoes polished, and a faint smell of vanilla cookies would waft through the air at night, though she hadn't baked a thing. Determined to solve the mystery, Emma set up cameras around the house. For 3 days, nothing happened. But on the 4th night, as she reviewed the footage, she couldn't believe her eyes. There, in the dead of night, was a shadowy figure moving around her living room, tidying up. The figure wasn't a ghost at all, it was a tiny, elderly woman. Emma tracked her down the next day. It turned out to be Mrs. Belkin, the reclusive neighbor from across the street. She had lived in the house decades ago and had grown so attached to it that she kept sneaking in through the back door, convinced that no one could take care of it quite like she could.
But I wasn't trying to scare you. I just missed the place, that's all.
Emma, thoroughly amused, decided not to press charges or make a fuss. In fact, they ended up making an unusual deal. Mrs. Belkin could continue her late-night visits, as long as she baked those delicious cookies Emma kept smelling. Emma even left little thank-you notes around the house, jokingly requesting tasks, like cleaning the attic or organizing the spice rack, and to her surprise, Mrs. Belkin happily obliged. In the end, the haunted house wasn't haunted at all, just meticulously maintained by a former owner who couldn't quite let go. Emma found herself enjoying the company, even if it was in the form of midnight house cleaning from a quirky neighbor. It wasn't the peaceful retreat she had expected, but it was definitely the most entertaining. One evening, as they were laughing over tea and cookies, Emma asked Mrs. Belkin what really happened to the original owner. Mrs. Belkin grinned mischievously and replied,
Oh, I made sure they never left. They're still here somewhere, probably under the flower beds. But that's a story for another day.
For the first time, Emma wasn't sure if Mrs. Belkin was joking. As Emma pondered Mrs. Belkin's words, a chill ran down her spine. Was the old woman serious? The mischievous grin, those piercing eyes, and that final sentence, probably under the flower beds, played over and over in her mind. She chuckled nervously, brushing it off. It had to be a joke. Mrs. Belkin was quirky, sure, but crazy? That seemed a bit far-fetched. Still, Emma couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her gut. The next day, she found herself staring at the flower beds. They were impeccably maintained, with bright blooms of hydrangeas and roses, far too beautiful to hide any dark secrets. Right? That night, Emma lay in bed, wide awake. The house, usually comforting with its faint creaks and soft sounds, felt different. There was an odd tension in the air, like the walls were holding their breath. The vanilla cookie scent that had once been pleasant now seemed cloying, overwhelming, as though it were masking something more sinister. Around midnight, Emma heard the familiar shuffling footsteps downstairs. Mrs. Belkin was back. Emma had grown accustomed to the late-night visits, but this time, she felt an urgency to confront her. Maybe it was the offhand comment about the original owner, or maybe it was the growing list of strange occurrences. Whatever it was, she needed answers. She slipped out of bed and crept down the stairs, careful not to make a sound. From the kitchen doorway, she could see Mrs. Belkin humming softly as she dusted off Emma's shelves, just like always. But something was different. The old woman's movements were quicker, more deliberate, as if she were in a hurry. And when Emma's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed Mrs. Belkin wasn't dusting, she was rifling through the drawers. Looking for something? Emma's voice came out sharper than she intended. Mrs. Belkin froze, then turned slowly, her face calm but her eyes darting around, calculating. "Oh, dear, I didn't mean to wake you. I was just, well, I thought I'd organize the kitchen for you. You've got quite a few things out of place." She chuckled lightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Emma crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What did you mean last night, about the original owner? About them being under the flower beds?" The old woman stared at her for a moment, then smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Emma's skin crawl. "It was just a joke, dear. You young folks are always so quick to take things seriously." She turned back to the drawer, but her hands trembled slightly, and she fumbled with the cutlery. Emma didn't buy it. Something was definitely off. Over the next few days, Emma's paranoia grew. She found herself double-checking the locks, watching her back, and avoiding Mrs. Belkin's house whenever possible. She even considered moving out, but something, whether it was curiosity or stubbornness, kept her from packing up. One evening, she finally caved and decided to do some research. She dug through old town records, hoping to learn more about the house and its previous owners. To her surprise, she found an article from 30 years ago. The headline read, "Local woman mysteriously disappears from suburban home." Her heart pounded as she skimmed the details. The woman, named Margaret Lane, had rented the house and vanished without a trace. The police had questioned several neighbors, including an elderly woman living across the street, Mrs. Belkin. But no charges were ever filed, and the case went cold. Emma stared at the article, her hands trembling. Could it be possible? Could Mrs. Belkin have been involved? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Was it really just a coincidence that Mrs. Belkin had been so attached to the house, and that she knew so much about its history? That night, as Emma tossed and turned, she heard something outside her window. Peeking through the curtains, she saw Mrs. Belkin in her yard, hunched over the flower beds, digging. No. It couldn't be. The next day, Emma decided to take matters into her own hands. While Mrs. Belkin was out, she grabbed a small shovel and headed to the flower beds. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dug, each scoop of dirt feeling heavier than the last. She didn't know what she expected to find, maybe just roots or buried trinkets. But then, her shovel hit something hard. Emma's breath hitched as she scraped away more dirt. Slowly, a small wooden box emerged, weathered and cracked from years underground. She pulled it out, her hands shaking. It was locked, but the hinges were rusted enough that she could pry it open with little effort. Inside were old letters, faded, yellowed with age, but still legible. They were addressed to someone named Margaret, written in a shaky hand. The words told a story of obsession, of a woman who had grown too attached to the house, and of a terrible accident that had happened one night. As Emma read, her stomach twisted. The final letter ended abruptly, with a cryptic message: "I had to make sure she'd never leave me. The house needs her, just like it needs me." Emma dropped the letter, her breath shallow. It wasn't just a crazy story. Mrs. Belkin had done something awful. Just then, she heard the creak of the back door. Emma's blood ran cold as she turned to see Mrs. Belkin standing there, her eyes cold and hard. "I see you've been digging," Mrs. Belkin said softly, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I told you, dear, the house likes to keep its secrets." Emma swallowed, stepping back. She didn't know what Mrs. Belkin was capable of, but one thing was clear: she wasn't the harmless old woman she pretended to be. "Now," Mrs. Belkin said, advancing slowly, "let's talk about what happens next." The house, once a picture-perfect retreat, now felt like a prison. Emma's mind raced as Mrs. Belkin came closer. Could she make a run for it? Call for help? But she realized, in that moment, she didn't have time. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and the lights flickered. Mrs. Belkin stopped in her tracks, her face paling. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No, not now." Emma's heart pounded as the air in the room shifted. The walls creaked, and from the corner of her eye, Emma saw a shadow form, tall, looming, and unmistakably human. It moved toward Mrs. Belkin, its presence suffocating, menacing. "Margaret," Mrs. Belkin whispered, her voice cracking with fear. The shadow surged forward, engulfing Mrs. Belkin, who let out a strangled cry before collapsing to the floor. Emma stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. The shadow lingered for a moment, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Mrs. Belkin lay motionless on the floor, her body still, her face twisted in terror. The house was silent again, save for the faint rustle of wind through the open window. Shaking, Emma rushed out of the house, dialing the police as she ran. When they arrived, they found Mrs. Belkin's lifeless body, but no sign of what, or who, had caused her death. The officers chalked it up to natural causes, but Emma knew better. The next morning, Emma made her decision. She didn't care how beautiful the house was or how much she had loved the peaceful surroundings. She packed her things, not bothering to organize them neatly, and loaded her car. As she locked the door for the final time, she glanced back at the flower beds. They stood quietly, the wind barely rustling the petals. For a moment, Emma swore she saw a figure, tall, shadowy, standing near the hydrangeas. But she blinked, and it was gone. Without a second thought, she drove away, the house shrinking in her rearview mirror. She knew she would never return. Later that night, in a hotel far from the suburbs, Emma sat on the bed, replaying everything in her mind. She realized she'd never know the full story of what happened in that house, or whether Mrs. Belkin had really done something to Margaret Lane. But one thing was certain: the house had its secrets, and some mysteries were better left unsolved. As she lay down to sleep, she whispered one final goodbye to the house, hoping it would finally let her go. But in the back of her mind, Emma knew, some things never truly leave you.